All right, we're live. We're back. My name is Sunny Ray. This is the Sunny Ray Show. Thanks to our sponsors, Raz Rocket, GTM Ventures. Today, I'm joined by Matt McDonnell. Matt, how you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And where in the world are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Austin, Texas.
Ooh, yeah, big fan of Texas. My dad spent almost 10 years there, and it was harder to get him out of Texas than it was to get my 2-year-old out of the room 5 minutes ago. There's something
True.
about that state, man. Were you born and raised there, or did you move there at
No,
some
I
point?
was, as the saying goes, I wasn't born here, but I got here as fast as I could. I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and then was nomadic on sailboats for most of my 20s all over the place. Landed in Charleston, South Carolina for what I thought was going to be a weekend and ended up being about 4 years. And then we moved to Austin, my wife and I, in 2010.
Interesting. Hey, so Matt, like I was saying, maybe let's kick off with a sentence or two about your firm, what you guys do, and then, like I said, maybe we'll put that on ice and come back to it at the end of the interview. But just would love to give people a bit of a heads up in terms of where we're going.
Yeah, sure. So I run two businesses. So one is a ground up development firm called the Geyser Group, based in Austin, Texas. We primarily do multifamily and for sale residential product. And then out of that business, really saw the prop tech opportunity over the last decade or so. And so Stellify Venture Capital is a seed stage prop tech investor that focuses on companies that deliver value in the commercial real estate value chain. And occasionally we'll get into industries that are tangential to it, like insurtech and fintech.
Interesting. Cool. So I've got a bunch of questions on that front, but like I said, maybe let's come back to it in a bit. For me, it's all, the story of the company falls a bit flat without context around the person. So maybe let's start with your background. So did you study philosophy? Was it at Colgate?
Yeah, I did. I joked that I double majored in philosophy. I went to college thinking I'd be a history major, and then I fell in love with philosophy in the first class that I took. It was sort of a nice combination of a bunch of interests, but I just I've sort of always been the kind of person that if I'm not deeply interested in it, I have a hard time paying attention to it, and so I really enjoyed it. And so, yeah, really focused on that. And specifically, philosophy of physics was the focus. And so the idea in that field is, experimental data takes a long time to come to fruition, right? Particularly when you're using things like the Large Hadron Collider or astrophysics tools. And so the role of a philosopher in that field is really to sort of ask the questions like, what data would confirm or deny this hypothesis, right? Or where are the areas of inquiry that are most likely to solve these particularly challenging problems? And then the scientists obviously do the work, but it's sort of an iterative feedback between the philosopher of science and the experimental field that's actually gathering the data.
Cool. And then after college, instead of heading to Wall Street or law school right away, you spent 5 years living and working on sailboats as an outward bound sailing instructor. So I'm just curious, what was it about that life on the water that called to you? What did those early years teach you about leadership that a classroom never could?
Yeah, so I was. It all started when I was a Boy Scout. So I was an Eagle Scout, and we did a program, myself and some other folks in my troop, where we flew to Miami and then sailed from Isla Morada to Key West. So I was 15 years old, and that was a big aha moment for me. Everything about it I enjoyed. Right, it was challenging. It was a super dynamic environment. I love being outside. That's sort of how I spend all my recreational time. And so after that point, I did what I could to keep learning it in a landlocked state in Pennsylvania without parents that were sailors. So I did, a little bit of small boat sailing and sort of got access wherever I could. And then when I went to college, Colgate had a very good, still does, an outdoor ed program where they train a few students every year, about 15 or so, to become staff members to lead pre-orientation wilderness trips for freshmen, as well as teach PE classes and then other recreational opportunities, but all centered around a variety of outdoor activities. And so in that program, I fell in love with sea kayaking, and one of the assistant directors, who eventually became the director, was a sea kayak instructor for Outward Bound. And so for me, that was a step towards sailing, right? I had to do a tour of duty, living in a sea kayak for a summer on the coast of Maine, and then that program got canceled. And so I felt like I had sort of found my dream job. I like a minimalist lifestyle, right? I like being outside. It's my favorite way to connect with people. I feel like it's, you could have 1,000 coffees with somebody and not get as close as you will, or understand each other as well as if you live on a boat for a week together. And so I really liked that part of it. So I always say that, sailing was a good prep for startup life, because you're doing hard things with a lot of dynamics, dynamic environment, a lot of uncertainty. It never goes the way you plan, and you have to adopt, and there's literally no way to run away from your problems, right? If you have a challenge with a person or a problem with the boat, right, you're sort of in it and having to use whatever resources you currently have or can scramble to get access to solve it. And so I think, I really liked that sort of scrappy nature, and didn't realize at the time that it translated very well into startup life. But, I think that those are something that I enjoy about, what I do now, that I sort of learned about living on a sailboat. And on the, what I learned, right, it was really a character development and leadership program is sort of the core of Outward Bound. And so I worked for them for a while, also worked for a few other organizations on larger boats, like 140-foot sort of tall ships. And what I found most fascinating about that was just it's such a great leveler, right? So no matter who you are in life, you don't know how to sail a traditionally rigged tall ship, right, or a wooden boat. And so everybody sort of starts off on this equal playing field. And then the folks that really rise into leadership positions, it's not really contrived, right? They're the ones that are, they're learning the fastest. They're good at galvanizing their peers towards, joint action, right, on whatever needs to happen. And so I really felt like it was a very good microcosm. And so I got to work with everybody from adjudicated youth to vets returning from Iraq and Afghanistan before they reintegrated into their life, to business school students at Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth or Chicago Booth. And so I got this just incredible exposure to a really wide swath of humanity that I wouldn't have otherwise had such concentrated access to. And I think that's one of the other things that's really important about venture, right, is you meet all sorts of people. It's also true of real estate. I always say it's the only market that every person on the planet participates in, right? And so being able to really understand people that are fundamentally different from you in their mindset and their background and their experiences is pretty darn valuable. And you can get that in a classroom, but at the end of the day, right, if you're say in an MBA program or in law school, everybody has a lot more in common, right, than just sort of the grabbing people from the larger population and putting them into an unfamiliar situation.
And then you also spent a year as a classroom teacher at the Brooke Charter School in Boston, and then moved to Charleston to run programs at the South Carolina Maritime Foundation. So, and I believe you co-founded 2 dropout prevention programs using a tall ship. So what was it about education and at-risk youth that kept pulling you in, and what made you eventually decide to pivot away from that path?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things. I mean, I still am a very firm believer that education's a great equalizer, right? Despite a lot of the conversations that are happening right now about the value of it, right? And not I don't have a defined opinion on how you get that education, right? But I sort of saw in my own life, going to Colgate, it was a need blind admissions year. They ran an experiment. And so I was, did well in high school and, should have been competitive in the college admission process. And all of a sudden I got into this school that changed my life, right? That I wouldn't have been able to pay for otherwise if they weren't running this program. And so I always, and still to this day, feel this deep sense of responsibility to sort of pay those kinds of experiences forward. And so when I ended up in Charleston, I was supposed to be in the Caribbean for the next 6 months teaching a program for Outward Bound. The program under enrolled, and so I got a phone call. I delivered a boat from Newport, Rhode Island to Charleston, And when I got off the boat, I checked my email, and it turned out the program was was under enrolled, and they were looking for instructors to volunteer to not teach the program. But it was so close to the start that you were still going to get paid. And so, I looked around this beautiful town that I had never been to before and said, you know what, I think there's some opportunity for me here. So I'll volunteer not to teach this semester gap year program. And so I had enough time to, find a job because I had some income, and fell in love with the boat, called the Spirit of South Carolina. It was just the prettiest boat I had ever seen. And then I walked up and started to ask the crew and the staff, a little bit more information, and sort of one thing led to another. There were some mutual points of connection to sail training's a sort of inherently small world and a tight-knit community. And so before I knew it, I was living on the boat as an educator. And what I had seen at Outward Bound was really, what I talked about before. It's this great leveling experience. And when I was working as a charter school teacher, I was what's called an associate teacher. And so I did a tour of duty in a kindergarten classroom, 8th grade, 5th grade, and then ultimately landed in a 1st grade classroom. And these are students that come from some of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston, right? They sort of have the deck stacked against them. And what I realized was that giving them these high quality educational experiences in an environment where they could thrive and not worry about some of those challenges that they may experience at home was really transformative, right? And the big thing that it gave them was a belief in their own self-efficacy. And so when I looked at the programming that we could do on this tall ship, we served some private schools, right? We did a human ecology program with a private girls' school. We did another mission and service-oriented program with a private high school that we took to the Dominican Republic. But I sort of felt like there was more from a mission perspective that we can do. And so I met with one of the leaders of the Charleston County School District, and they said, hey, look, we actually have this idea. We have a risk score on students, right? The data is pretty clear that there's, call it, I don't know, I don't recall the numbers, but somewhere between 20 and 50 characteristics that, you can score a student on based on their background and circumstances. And it's highly predictive of whether or not they will graduate high school. And so this director of prevention and intervention said to me, what if we gave you a list of 50 students that were most at risk of dropping out before they started high school? And so statistically, none of these kids should graduate. And what if you built a program for them? And so what we did was devised a 7-week program to really get students ready to have that experience. I mean, these were kids whose streets would flood at high tide and they'd never been to the beach, and it's 3 miles away from their home. And so there was a lot of sort of work and preparation to do to live in this really kind of not just new, right, but potentially scary, weird environment, right? You had to build a lot of trust with the families. And then after these 7 weeks of preparation, put them all on a plane, flew them to New York City, which they had also never done before, to give them that experience. And then did a 7-day program around Long Island Sound and Buzzards Bay. And really the idea is, day one, nobody knows what they're doing. And at the end of that program, both from the education you got on the shore, as well as the practical experience on the boat, and they had other boat days too, they were able to run the ship on their own at the end, right? And if you can sort of overcome that set of obstacles, right, and put yourself in that position, then, a hard homework problem or other challenges that you're facing start to sort of feel a little bit more manageable and sort of have that belief in yourself. And so that program, we lost a couple students who, basically did some things that made it impossible to take them on a boat. The Coast Guard's a highly regulated industry, and anybody who used drugs or alcohol could not be on the boat because the whole crew's licenses would be at risk. But other than those two, 100% of those students that finished the program ended up graduating high school. And then unfortunately, we weren't able to convince the state of South Carolina to continue the funding for the program. So we then had to turn to private funding sources. But it was a super powerful experience, and I think that it worked pretty well for the students as well.
Interesting. So when you look at your journey, Matt, philosophy degree, sailing instructor, charter school teacher, dropout prevention work, law school dropout, ed tech COO. It's about as non-linear as it gets. Do you think that winding path gave you advantages that someone with maybe a more traditional finance or tech background wouldn't have?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, I sort of mentioned it earlier, right? Without me being deeply interested in something, it's not when I perform my best. So I sort of recognized early on in my life that I really needed to care deeply about whatever I was doing. And also that I don't really have that much control over what I get curious about, right? And I think that's true of most people. So I think that, in hindsight, right, it looks like a winding road, but at any point in time, the question was always, okay, well, this thing is coming to a transition point. What am I most interested in doing next? And when I've made career transitions, one thing that I always keep in mind, and I talk to a lot of law school students who are thinking about going into law school or trying to figure out what role they want to pursue. And I always ask them, where is a law degree least valuable? Right. And for me, the answer is it's in a law firm or a courtroom. And so what I was able to do with a legal background in a ed tech startup, right, was sort of be the go-to guy for solving privacy concerns, content licensing issues, right? And so you have an ability, if you're sort of the square peg in a sea of round holes, to add outsized value. And I think that really accelerates your ability to move forward, right? And I've since seen that with a lot of other folks. Like, I think anytime you have the option to hire somebody from one of the U.S. military academies or special forces, right, you just do it, right? Because you sort of have this skill set that is not something you're going to find out of, your business school recruitment or a former Wall Street sort of employee. Because the world's changing so fast, right? That the most important thing is that you can learn quickly, right? And you can make sense of a lot of complexity. And so I think those skills I've definitely had to develop, changing careers and taking a non-traditional path.
And then while you were still in law school, you joined Famigo. Can you talk a little bit about that experience? Just how did you go from law school intern to running operations at a funded startup?
Yeah, it was an interesting story. I mean, the honest truth is that I showed up to law school thinking I wanted to be a lawyer. So that was the plan. I had finished an MBA with a finance concentration 4 days before law school started. And when I got to law school, and I remember they brought us into this big room at UT, and they said to us, they started to explain the legal profession and what we could expect. And I sort of had this sinking feeling in my stomach of, oh my God, I don't know if I should be here. And within about a week or two of doing the actual work, I realized that, thank God there are people that are very good lawyers. We need them, but I'm not one of them. And so I realized that I didn't have that deep level of interest. So I went to career services and I said, hey, I don't think I should be here. I'm much more interested in entrepreneurship and finance. Is there anybody that I can talk to who's gone through law school knowing they didn't want to be a lawyer? They basically said no. They're like, no, nobody, lots of people leave the profession after, 5-10 years. But in general, people, why would you come here, right? And incur this expense and have this experience if you knew you didn't want to be a lawyer? And so I started to cast around for different opportunities. And I did a program called 3-Day Startup, which is a weekend-long hackathon to ideate and build new businesses. And while nothing meaningful came out of that experience for me in terms of a business I was working on, the day after that weekend was over, I got an email that said, hey, there's this company that we're affiliated with, and that's called Famigo, and they're looking for an intern to help with content. And so, I'm here in the first month or two of law school, and it sounded like a pretty interesting thing to explore. And what really resonated with me was that it was a mobile content distribution platform for educational content for 2 to 6 year olds. And so it really fit neatly with two beliefs, right? One was just sort of my experience with early childhood education. And then the second one was through some volunteer work, I had become interested in this fellow named James Heckman, who's published a lot of data on how truly determinative high quality pre-K education is to the quality of life of that adult as they grow up. And so I realized, hey, here's an opportunity at scale, right, to give children access to educational materials that they might not otherwise have. And so, I was interested, I was passionate, I was committed. And so I was able to, use my law school education and sort of take more ownership of it. And, when I had to figure out how to license content, right, I took the transactional drafting class. When I had to figure out privacy, I did a couple of independent studies because we were involved in advocacy around the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And so at the end of the day, the value of doing those two things together was much more than the sum of the parts.
Cool. Let's switch gears a little bit. So after Famigo exited, you and one of your investors started a family office. Is that correct? Seneca. So,
Notley is the name of the family office, but yeah,
Notley's right. So I guess at one point, was that like a 7-year journey that you guys embarked upon? And I was curious, I was reading about that, and you guys were allocating capital to venture and real estate. Was there a specific moment during those years where you thought, why am I paying someone else to develop real estate when I could do this myself?
Yeah, I mean, there were two pieces of that, right? One is, you have to recall this is like early 2010s in Austin, and it did not take a genius to figure out that there was about to be a boom, right? I mean, at that point, when I moved to Austin, there were 159 people moving to the city every day. That number has since increased, and it has not slowed down. And so it was pretty obvious when you're walking around downtown with dirt parking lots, right, and nowhere near enough housing, and also a real affordability advantage, right? When I moved here, people used to joke that like this was where 30-year-olds came to retire and buy a nice house in the suburbs, right? And so that was pretty obvious. And so making LP investments and seeing what those folks did and how it went was a good sort of first step. And then we started doing things on our own balance sheet, smaller projects. And at the end of the day, real estate is largely translating legal documents to Excel models or Excel models to legal documents. And so having both of those formal educations, I think, sort of gave me the confidence that I would be able to be successful at it. But like anything else, it just started small and kept iterating until we were doing, large $100 million ground up developments of 350-ish or more apartment buildings.
And what was the insight at Notley that led you to believe that you could blend profit and purpose? And then more importantly, what did building Notley teach you about yourself as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, well, I think I learned a lot about what I didn't know and what I didn't want to do, right? So I still have a desire to get better and learn more about public equities and daily liquid securities. I mean, I know enough to be dangerous, but I'm certainly not a professional in that field. And then I also learned what I really enjoyed, which I think sort of harkened back to the sailing days, which is doing, hard stuff with small groups of people in a dynamic environment. And so when I looked back at the track record that we had built through various allocation decisions, it was very clear to me that early stage venture and real estate were the two areas where, my skill set produced better results, or at least I was consistently, putting myself in a position to be lucky. And so I think that was a big part of it. And then I think the other thing that I learned about myself was not just what I like to do, right, but the quality of your day-to-day life really mattered. And so as I started to do real estate, that also forced me to be geographically focused. So most of the projects that I've done, I've found, riding my bike or running around East Austin in our neighborhood. And so, I really sort of used that opportunity to figure out, okay, well, it's great to have career ambitions, right? But your life is what happens, between the time you wake up and the time you go to bed. And so what do I really want that to look like? And that was really ultimately the reason that I also got off Sailboats, right? You sort of get sick of sleeping on a moldy pillow, want to get married and have a family. And so that was pretty hard to do in that environment. But I think I really sort of refined what I wanted that to look like while I was at Notley, and getting just a tremendous panoramic view of the private markets and the various opportunities and the various trends that I felt like I could take advantage of.
So Stellify now has 13 portfolio companies. Are you guys at 13 now?
I think we're at 14 now.
14. Okay, so you're spanning operational tech, insure tech, construction tech, and you said that about half the portfolio is operational technology. So can you walk us through how you and your partners actually evaluate a prop tech company? What does the diligence process look like when you're also a potential customer?
Yeah. So, well, I think that you sort of hit on one of the key components, right? Which is that there are a lot of very good prop tech VCs out there, right? But there aren't a lot of very good prop tech VCs that also are operators of real estate businesses. And so the hardest part about, I think, about real estate technology, particularly in the commercial space, is that you're selling to a very interesting customer, right? It's not like a normal B2B SaaS sale. So what you see a lot of people do is they'll go chase the 900-pound gorilla, the Gray Stars of the world or BlackRock or whoever, right? And those are super long sales cycles. They run a lot of experiments because anything that works is going to have a tremendous amount of value at that scale. But really where the adoption happens is lower and middle market developers and owners and operators who own somewhere between, 1,000 and maybe 25,000 units, right, of multi as an example, or, a couple million square feet of commercial office. And generally, there's a concentration of decision-making authority in a small executive team or a single owner, and they have the ability to experiment, right, in a way that some of these larger firms may not. And so I think that for us, really understanding that go-to-market strategy and also how we can help, because those are our peers and our colleagues, is really important. And then, with any business, right, you have your go-to-market strategy. You've got your founding team, you've got your product, right? Those are sort of the three core pieces. And so we definitely spend a lot of time thinking about all of those. But I think, taking a step back and looking at, okay, what are the business characteristics? Day one, any business that we invest in has to make something that the owner and operator of that real asset is already doing. It has to make it better, faster, cheaper, right? You don't have the luxury in this industry of saying, hey, someday this is going to be really valuable, right? You have to deliver either a lower cost or higher revenue, particularly in an environment where real estate operators are getting squeezed from every direction. So that's a really important key feature. And then in terms of a defensible moat for that business, the other thing that we look for is there are still data sets that don't exist in real estate, right? So the boiler in your kid's school, right? I don't think anybody has written down what that part number is, right? There's not a lot of predictive data. You see this in the paving industry, you see it in tenant communications. And so these data sets are being built. And so while all the companies in our portfolio are AI native, the most important part is that you have a hard to impossible to replicate data set. And that's really the work, right? So if the SaaS product can collect that data, however you happen to do it, visual inspections with a camera on your phone or what have you, then that gives you a real opportunity to, not only have already delighted that customer and become a really sticky product, but then the data exhaust is very valuable. And once that system is up and running, the switching costs are huge, right? You wouldn't want to lose that data set that software vendor that you're working with owns. So those are sort of the general ways that we think about it. And then we, of course, do customer interviews and talk to the other investors, right? We spend a lot of time with these businesses because we get very operationally involved. We meet with them weekly, sometimes monthly, but we're not waiting for a board meeting, right? We're, early stage investment is sort of an augmentation of your executive team in a lot of ways with the board and the leader of your round.
Cool. Well, we've done, 30 minutes. That went by super fast. So maybe I'll land the plane with this last question. By the way, I only got through maybe half of them, Matt. So would love to bring you back for maybe a part two. But so you split your time between Austin and Steamboat Springs, correct?
Yes.
And so just curious, like, how do you think about designing your life so that all of these things we spoke about, raising a family, writing a book, running a podcast, developing real estate, investing in startups, how do you, bring it all together? And what advice would you give to somebody who is perhaps listening to this and looking to create this multi-dimensional career?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we talked about was you just need to follow your interests, right? So all of those things that you mentioned, that's what's going on there. I think getting a lot of leverage on your time, right? So, using virtual assistants or things like that, playbooks that are predetermined, I think certainly help. But I actually think that the hardest part about it is that you just need to put yourself out there that that's what you're doing, right? So early when I started splitting time, I always felt awkward. I didn't want to call attention to it, right? But what I've really been able to focus on is, look, this is who I am. This is what I'm going to do. If that's a problem for, this partnership or this potential business, then it's probably just not a fit. And I think that takes a lot of self-confidence, right? And I think that the way that you can be successful at that is if you engage in business activities where there's an objective measure of success, right? Is the IRR of the portfolio what you need it to be, right? So it's not like I go to Steamboat and disappear, but I will fish for 2 hours a day in the evening or in the morning right before work starts. And so you sort of find that balance. But at the end of the day, if there's an objective measure of success, then it's pretty easy to tell, both for yourself, right, but also for the people that you're responsible to, whether they're LPs or colleagues, that you're actually doing everything you need to do. And then when you feel confident in that, that's when you can maybe add another thing, right? So it's just like building a startup, right? The founder does everything themselves for a little bit, and then after a while, you figure out how to put somebody else in that role and somewhat automate it and manage it, and then you can start working on the next thing that is really important in that life that you want to build.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. That was amazing. I learned a lot. Thank you all for tuning in as well. Matt, just maybe hang back for 1 minute. I'll bring this stream to an end. Anything else you want to share? Maybe just the website name and where people can double click on your train of thought.
Yeah, so my website is mmmcdonnell.com, and I have a podcast called Navigating Complexity. There's a first season out, and it's interviews with other founders that have had non-traditional, non-linear career paths, but are sort of successful by whatever metric you choose to apply.
Love it. All right, thank you all, and until next time.